Okay, hello, Blue, Keith, and anyone else following along. This is a rough positional mock-up of, generally speaking, my concept at the moment for the GUI. Now, not everything is showing right now, and there's some things that are showing that shouldn't be. You'll also notice that I munged up the background because I didn't want excessive icons on there, confusing what we're looking at. I also just went with big different colors on here so that it's easy to tell the different things apart. So I'm also not going to get into too much depth in what's in each thing because I don't really think that that's important at this particular stage anyway. So for the very simplest bit, we've got this development build block out down here. Unfortunately, whenever we do a build that actually lets us get line numbers and it says development build, it's going to put that right there. And so if we can treat that area like the plague and not put anything there, then that's helpful to people not going, what's that under there? Does that say menu? You know, that sort of thing. Then we've got the bottom left buttons here, which are something. I don't know what they are. Doesn't necessarily matter. Right now, they have like control groups and a whole bunch of things. And this bottom left button section spans all the way across the screen. Now, I don't have a problem with how wide this goes. If it wants to go anywhere up to where the blockout is for this, then this being able to stretch across is okay with me. But I don't think that it needs to necessarily. And the idea is that this is probably one row of buttons, and it's overall things like, build, science, or like build, tech, click here for the arc, the click here for the galaxy map, stuff like that. So it's a little functional area. Exactly what goes in there is actually probably going to be one of the bigger sources of debate as people are talking about things. And with that in mind, exactly how wide that goes is going to be another big point of debate. The fact that this is a horizontally oriented bottom left thing, I think, is important because of some of the other bits that wind up appearing on the screen. That was where it was in AI War Classic as well, and I think that it made sense there. Now, at this point here, we've got the Planetary view sidebar here. This being basically the types of ships, that are at the planet at the moment, and that's going to be somewhere between what we have right now and what we had in Classic, I assume. One thing that I did want to actually mention with the bottom left buttons thing, depending on what the screen resolution is, this would take up more or less of the screen. So for instance, this is a 1920 by 1080 mock-up right here. But if we chopped this such that this is like 1024 is like right here. So if we chopped this, then since this doesn't overlap the blockout, this actually could stay exactly the same. But then these pieces here would slide over. At that point, though, you have this yellow bit doesn't fit, so it actually need to shrink down to fit on. This pink bit would definitely not fit, so it'd have to scoot down underneath the yellow bit. This pink bit here knocks down the blue bit, depending on how big it is, or it slides over kind of in between the yellow and the blue bit. Exactly what those behaviors are something that we would have, we'll have to define as well. And that's why I'm making a video versus just writing this up, is because being able to point to that stuff is kind of nice. Now, When we're talking about screen sizes, then inevitably we get into pixel density questions as well. And if we're talking 1920 by 1080, which is what I've mocked up here as the default, that's probably the most common screen resolution that most people are going to have now. However, that's going to vary from like a 11 or 13-inch laptop all the way up to, you know, a 30-inch screen. Somebody was mentioned they had like a 32-inch TV, I think, that was that size that they were playing on. And so they're going to want to be able to adjust the scale of the GUI. And so with that GUI scale piece, what that would do is that would say, okay, if we're drawing the GUI scale at 1, then it does what I just showed. If we're drawing the GUI scale at 0.75, then it would shrink this red down to 75% of its normal size, and it would just draw like that. And then that would be the first thing that would happen, is that it would say, okay, well, my size is now this because my default size is here. Now my new size is 75% of that. Woohoo. Now, when it starts trying to position windows based off of different screen size, aspect ratios, or other things that may or may not be around, then it shuffles itself based off that. So for instance, if you have a size set to 2, and this thing is actually drawing like this because maybe we're actually on a 4K display, but it's not really actually a 4K display, it's actually a Retina display, and so it's the back and it's double density of pixels. So, this gigantic looking size is actually something that is really only taking up the same amount of space that you would associate with this on a non-Retina screen. So, okay, so they've set, we want this to be twice as large as normal. If that's the case, then we're going to need to say the same logic. Okay, this is the default, this is the size they wanted it to be at. So when this thing, if we went to an aspect ratio that's like this, well, normally this is going to be right here, but it's going to be pushing into the little development blockout area. So actually what we're going to have to do is then shrink this back down. So if the aspect ratio is like this and they say they want 2x, well, then this is actually going to calculate out, hey, the most I can actually be is 1.6x. And so this thing winds up being 1.6x, but maybe this winds up being the full 2x just because of how things have to shuffle. The order of operations in terms of when things size and why, like by user request, by aspect ratio, or because of getting shuffled out of the way of something else, is one of those things that has to be defined, and that is very, it affects everything, basically. What's most important? Those things should size first, and then everything else should get out of their way. Well, really, there's a couple of sizing loops, and Keith, you could have fun with that. So that's the general concept of this. The whole notion of there being like this is the specific percentage size of the screen, I don't really think that necessarily has a place here. Overall, I would say, this little bottom section is by default going to be, let's say, well, I mean, what is this? This is, okay, 620 pixels wide. So we say, hooray, this is 620 pixels wide. But if somebody says they want a GUI scale of twice that, then okay, this is now 1200 some odd pixels wide. And it's oriented down there to the bottom left. If that winds up pushing into something else, then it gets shrunk down. We say, it's 800 pixels wide. We actually get to talk about pixels again rather than percentages of the screen, because in no real instance here is there something that we're saying we want this to be anchored to two axes. We don't have anything that spans. Everything is oriented to either 1 or 0 horizontal and vertical spots. This is oriented bottom left. top left. This is really just to the left and then bump down from where that is, top left, the left, and then bump down by this, and then this bottom right on these, sorry. Um, so everything is kind of relative, and we don't have anything that's like, we want this to be 80% of the way across. I don't care how far across that goes. That messes with things based off the screen aspect ratio. It should, if my screen is like this or my screen is like this, it shouldn't really affect that bar. And similarly, if my screen is like this, or if my screen is like this, none of those things should affect that bar unless that bar is getting in the way of things, or unless I as a user say, hey, this is, my screen is only that's so big. Let's show things at half size. Then everything shows at half size, and hooray, we're happy. Since most people are using 1920 by 1080, in other words, 1080p, let's kind of use that as our baseline. We can make some educated guesses. If somebody's running at 1024 by 768, we can say, you probably want a GUI scale that is, we'll find out, but like 0.6, the normal size or something, because probably that means that they're running at a lower pixel density on a like 17-inch monitor, let's say, and so it's not going to be too small to read if it's at 60%, but they'll actually have not their entire gameplay area covered in little windows. Okay, so far so good, I guess. But in terms of general concept, this is kind of what I've been going for from the start, but I didn't really have this well articulated ever, and so now I'm trying to articulate that. In terms of where things go on the screen, this is where we start getting into a more of a debate with players. This obviously is something we can't do anything about in the development builds. In a full release build that's not including stack traces, that won't be there. We still want to treat that like the plague. Bottom left, I think we pretty much want to have that there. This thing going on the right, there are arguments you can make for the little icons being on the left. However, I would point out that the tooltips go over here, and you're either going to have these things overlapping, or you're going to have the tooltips bumped over to the side of this. This thing can get thicker or be thinner, and so that can make the tooltips stick out more or less, which is why I stuck it over here in the first game, because it gets out of the way of the tooltips. So not having anything along the left here is a pretty good thing if the tooltips are going to be over on the left. Up here on the top right here, we've got a thing I called messages. And in the first game, whenever we wanted to say something temporarily to the player where they were chatting to each other, then we had messages that would pop up there. That was pretty useful. I think we're probably going to wind up having something along the same lines, unless we're cutting out text chat for some reason. Even if we're having fewer messages, ultimately there's still messages that go by, whether it's the AI taunting you or whatever. Those sort of things, top left seems as good as anything. We could put it down here though, if people prefer, and have it go bottom up like an RPG, so the most recent message is at the top. Whatever, I don't really care. Right now we've got this section here, which are called warnings, and that again is from the first game, and at the moment we seem to be doing that in the second game as well. Waves are incoming and things are happening at, cross-planet attack is coming in a while, and things of that nature. And that got nuts in the first game, so that in late game things, this thing could just dominate this side of the screen, which was very unpleasant. And I'd love a way to make it so that's not so obnoxious. Possibly moving kind of more icon based, so that there's like little wave icon or something and a little counter or something like that. And I guess we still have to have the planet name, but in general, we're trying to have shorter planet names, I think. So, I have been. So maybe that'll fit better, and we can actually go more like this with the warnings so that they all fit here. So we've got like little wave icon and planet name and a number, wave icon, planet name and a number, and across CPA icon, and then not a name, just number, that sort of thing. So maybe we can condense all that stuff into one long strand here. That'd be kind of nice. And then the top info area, I don't think there's really any disagreement on that being here. I made this kind of fat and tall. the way that I've got it now, but it's actually substantially thinner most of the time. But at any rate, you've got your general resource stuff up there. Maybe you have the planet name, maybe you don't. Maybe you have the, maybe that is something that gets shifted down here, here, or even here. I don't know. You have the game clock up there, maybe, or maybe that gets put down here, or here, or here. There's a few things of that nature that you could arguably move around, but the resources in general have been up there. In early mock-ups that we were doing with Blue, a lot of the resources and stuff actually shifted over here. We had like the AI progress there and some numbers and things. You can go back and Kickstarter and see that sort of thing. That all got shifted over there, and that was actually kind of nice. It fit pretty well, and we were having some warnings and stuff there, and then the text stuff would have to move somewhere else. So there are a variety of things that we could do. Probably keeping it simple to start out with and just going here is maybe job number one, and it's already there, so hey, that works. Now we come to the tooltips. I made a separate video about that just a bit ago, but basically the idea being that I'd like to see these be shorter and wider because that's the general aspect ratio that we have. And we have something that's basically like more plate-based, like a Magic Gathering card or any number of RTS games have that sort of thing, often baked into a static, immovable piece of HUD down at the bottom, which of course we're not doing. Although we did do that in Last Federation in the combat. At any rate, so we'd have a couple of different plates for different purposes. We have like a common theme with like, okay, we've got a box, then we've got a thing up here that says like name of the thing that's in the tooltip, and then you've got like this area which is blocked out for some longer form text, and if the text wouldn't normally fit in there, then the font gets smaller. And then this area is blocked out for one or more rows and columns of icons, and we can space those nicely and have them in neat columns, and everything's all tidy and feels good. Obviously, these colors have nothing to do with anything; they're just for contrast. And so then we come to this thing here, selection. This is from the first game. I don't think we have this in the current game. I don't remember. But basically, when you've selected some ships, then showing, you've got, 10 fighters, you've got 10 bombers, you've got, 3 missile corvettes, and you've got your arc selected or whatever. It would show that sort of thing in here. It'd have a scroll bar because we just can't show that whole thing. Now, should that be icons instead of text? Arguably so. That could then be way, way shorter and maybe doesn't use scroll bar. Still, potentially, somebody's going to have so many different things that ultimately it's going to overflow the bounds and need a scroll bar or something. It's either going to have to like expand upwards or have a scroll bar. So even if we were doing icons that are, relatively that size, and you're like, that's the fighter icon, hover over it to be sure, that's going to wind up being something we have to think, when somebody's got an insane game, how do we handle that? So that goes somewhere. In the first game, it was there. I don't really care if that goes there or not. That is the sort of thing that could go here, and then the tooltip overlays it. The tooltips that I was doing are, importantly, not very opaque. Not very transparent at all. They're almost completely opaque. So it means if there's some element behind them, pretty much blacks it out, which is good because that way, if it needs to overlap something that is not important, like I'm hovering over a unit over here and I've got my unit selection normally showing here, then that kind of replaces it, even though the unit selection didn't go away. If I then come over here and mouse over something in unit selection, well, then the tooltip would need to appear over here instead. And I view that as fair game because, yes, it's blocking a lot of my view at that point, but I'm explicitly hovering over something right here, and therefore I want to look at it. You get into other questions such as, if I mouse over something in the sidebar here, should the tooltip plate actually appear here instead of always in its designated spot down here? Arguably, maybe. If the tooltip plates are of a kind of fixed size, then we get into a little more latitude with moving them around being less jarring. But once we start having elements that are in fixed sizes, it's less of an issue. And if the tooltip is this kind of floating nebulous thing that the size and position of it never impacts the size or position of everything else, but it's opaque so it can overlap anything else and it doesn't matter, then a lot of complexity is gone from that too, which is nice. Now, um, two of the things that bug myself and seemingly Cyborg the moment are things like the build queue and the text and the build menu. So first of all, looking at this is ugly, obviously. This would be like the text or the build, like a structure or something that doesn't pop out of a queue, like a turret or something. Menu. And so, for instance, if this was a tech menu, it would have different little categories in tabs, and then it's got a scrollable list here, and actually says the name of the tech here. And that has the flexibility of being text-based, which normally not so hot, but in this particular case, odd as this is to say, I feel like we're actually kind of risking getting into icon overload. And so, for instance, if we're going to upgrade our fighters, then having a line that just says fighters and then it's like 2, and then like a little arrow to 3, then we can go, okay, we're upgrading our fighters from level 2 to level 3. We don't need to see an icon for fighters level 2, level 3, and level 4, and they're all like blacked out. Level 2 is grayed out because we've already got that one. And level 4 is grayed out because we can't get it yet, or whatever the case is. You could hover over it and have a tooltip that says, you've already got level 2 and it will cost you X to get level 4, but you have to get level 3 first. We can put whatever extra information we want in the tooltip, but basically by linearizing this into text, we can make it more directly and clearly and concisely say, what are your immediate actions that you can take? Can I upgrade my fighters at all? And if so, by what? And if not, why not? So it's like fighters, level 2 to level 3, it will cost you 2,000 science. You have that, so it's in green or whatever. Or it's like, you don't have enough science. And so it says, 2,000 science, but it's in red. If you hover over, it says not enough science. You can look up there and see, don't have enough science. And so we can convey a lot of those things we were conveying in the first game, but they were a lot of times when we were conveying that in the first game, we had to show only one thing. We could only show one of the error messages, not multiple, and it would there were a lot of limitations because of space, basically, and everything was very tiny. If you've upgraded all, your fighters all the way up, then I would argue that we should keep them there in the list, although maybe shuffle them down to the bottom. I don't know. That gets, when you move them, suddenly that becomes a problem. So maybe leaving them uselessly at the top is there, but basically have it grayed out and say like fighters, they're already marked 4, that you've unlocked. And so, mark, in a little note, it's like, you have to find mark 5. You don't upgrade them via here. So you're done with fighters. That's actually a way to kind of tutorialize people a little bit of, hey, there are mark 5, but you have to go find them. You can't just unlock them from here. So we can wrap all sorts of things into that. And how the tabs are handled exactly, whether they go in one or more rows, I don't know. They could be all in one row, but just have like a big icon and then like a couple of letters of text or something underneath them. That sounds familiar from the first game. Same sort of deal. We could do that across here if we wanted to. We could make this thing wider if we wanted to and have the text be in 2 columns even and scrollable. Uh, there's a variety of different things that we could do there, because I'm not feeling like we have to respect the center screen space too much when this thing is open. But we want to let people basically get in, see the text they're going to get, and then get out. When it's a build menu, I guess we do have to respect the center space more, because you click into turrets, then you want to get like lightning turrets or whatever and place those. In that particular case, you might have lightning turrets is like the text there. And then you have like 1, 2, 3, 4 is like little buttons or whatever. And you can click whichever one and then place them. I haven't thought this through, but that's an idea. Um, Something along those lines might function. For the build queue, this is very different from the actual build menu, the builder text one. So you've got the actual queue up here, and having a finite number of things you can put in the queue kind of makes sense, even though that might rub, I don't know. Maybe we have a scroll bar and people can just put however many things they want in there. Ultimately, people are going to ask us for that. So I retract that. No finite number of things, because people will ultimately be honest about they want to put more stuff in. So that's going to need a scroll bar that pops up sometimes. So you've got up here the title of what is this thing that has the queue. So this is like your arc and its queue of things that it's going to build, arc construction queue, or it's like space dock construction queue or whatever. And then you've got like little play pause button here. You've got a little button for if this loops or not. And then you've got all the little icons here that move to the left, just like in the first game with the little, how many are being built of that. And then down here, you've got a horizontally scrolling thing, I figure, because just the orientation of this has to be what it is, I think. And so you've got like Fighter 1, Fighter 2, Fighter 3, Fighter 4, I guess Fighter 5. And you can scroll across and see the other things. And I figure that we can, for the most part, maybe show text for that, like an abbreviated bit of text. I know that text can get overwhelming when there's too much of it, and maybe we ought to be going with the icons and reinforcing that. I just have this feeling that it gets when everything is suddenly like an Egyptian tablet with just icons everywhere, that gets a little overwhelming, I feel like. When it's just this weird grid of text, that gets overwhelming too. So there's some sort of balance between the two that we need to find out. And if you're clicking text in here, it says Fighter 1, and then it's drawing the fighter icon with a little 1 underneath it. Well, that's kind of weird too. So I don't know. We'll have to figure that out. But at any rate, this menu here is also something that can sit over top of the blue section here. And so as long as this is not any wider than the screen, this can pretty much overlap anything else, I think, while it's present. And then if the screen would cause it to be sticking off, then this thing scales itself down. And if it would be sticking up, it orients itself so that it's a little bit above this. And if it would be getting so high somehow that it would be getting over top of this, then it squishes itself down there too. So it does its math pretty late in, saying, don't be so tall, I overlap this, and don't be so wide, I overlap that. Otherwise, be the size I'm supposed to be based off of the innate size that I am supposed to be times the multiplier for the GUI scale that the player said that they wanted. When it comes to GUI scale modifier, and we start talking about things that are not one of these windows here, or not one of the things on the galaxy map, then that stuff doesn't use the GUI scale, and or at least not the normal GUI scale. If it does use one, it's using something else. And those are like menus that are separate from our like core GUI design and all this stuff that has to move around based on itself. That is the premise of the GUI that I'm pitching here. So hopefully this video makes sense, and thanks for watching.